at Boston in US, we attended a lecture during the IBA conference, and it was stated there that 20 years earlier before then, the Harvard Law School predicted that China would be the investment destination of the world. And by 2013, it was agreed that China was. And they were predicting then, by 2013, that Africa will be the next investment destination of the world in 20 years' time. If that is to happen, then we must be prepared. We must be prepared not only in creating economic environment, but also creating enabling dispute resolution environment. So, this morning, should investment opportunities be government-driven, or should it be in the hands of the private sector as is in other parts of the world? Agriculture is the mainstay in Nigeria, but if you look at foreign investment in the country, agriculture is not part of what is attractive to the investors. How can small-scale business finance dispute resolutions? What is the implication of failure of Nigeria to key into African Continental Free Trade Agreement? French-speaking nations have HOADA. Anglophone does not have any. Is there any implication? So we go straight to the discussion, and in doing that, we open with the first poll. If you look at the first poll, which we expect a response, what in your opinion is the largest hurdle to sustainable growth in Africa? You have options there. It's very obvious. It's very obvious. It's very, very obvious. So let me start with you, Greg. You advise investors coming to Africa, and especially to Nigeria, look at the poll. Look at the largest hurdle to sustainable growth. Will you say this may constitute impediment to investors coming to Africa or coming to Nigeria to invest? Greg, as a lawyer who advises investors, especially from the legal perspective, let's have your view.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, Your Excellency, thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers for having me and inviting me. I think what I'd like to do is take a moment to speak on each of those 5 points, because I think all of them are quite important, as whether on an individual level each of those 5 has a bearing on what my clients as non-African international businesses see as hurdles preventing them from investing or issues to take into account when they do invest. Looking at the first, corruption. Corruption has 2 sides. One is being corrupt and the other is being a victim of corruption. On the being corrupt side, my clients primarily are governed by some very strict anti-corruption rules, the FCPA, the UK Bribery Act. That has changed the landscape in the last decade or so. So from my client's perspective, they feel that they have now dealt with the possibility of their companies being corrupt, and the being corruption isn't a problem. For them, the problem is being the victim of corruption of corrupt officials. So the corruption is unfortunately something they take into account and something that they deal with. It increases the risk factor, but I think the existence of corruption as it is at the moment is not in itself a deal breaker for investment. It's just something that my clients need to take into account and obviously need to be extremely aware of and extremely cautious of, and there are ways around it. So no, I don't think it's a deal breaker, but it's a significant issue of concern. The second issue, political instability and no government support. Again, this is a real concern. Again, it's not a deal breaker, but it is a concern, but this feeds into the risk horizon and the risk factors that my clients look at. With political instability, with limited government support, it increases the risks. Some say where there's increased risks, there's increased rewards. Some of my clients have an appetite for what they see as increased risks. So again, political instability is a risk factor. Again, it's not a deal breaker, but it is something that they take into account. Lack of access to finance as I've mentioned, my clients are primarily international businesses, non-African businesses outside of Africa coming into the continent. For them, access to finance is less of a concern than it is for African businesses. So I can only speak for those coming in, whereas lack of access to finance is less of a concern. Looking at inefficient commercial dispute resolution and the dispute resolution framework. Now, this is a real concern, and perhaps that's because I'm speaking from an arbitration perspective and I'm speaking to a room full of arbitration lawyers. But my clients do see this as a real concern. If ultimately it is the final backstop if things do go wrong, and if they're unable to get that redress, then there are real concerns as to whether or not they're willing to invest. So that goes beyond merely a factor to take into account in the risk matrix. It's a big issue. And the final point, poor infrastructure. This is part of the assessment of whether a company or one of my clients will invest. It's what they look at as a risk factor. It's what they look at as the extent of the returns that they get. So I would say that it's not a risk. It's not a concern. It's just part of what they're involved with.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now let me move on to the representative of the MD of NISA, Mr. Ihedigo. You advise government on agribusiness. And I understand Kirby was the flagship of your activities. Now let me ask you, how much does Nigeria depend on government to drive the agenda for sustainable growth in Africa? In other words, which arm of government is best suited to drive sustainable growth?
Your Excellency, the Governor, and panel moderator, and distinguished panelists, the question is asked, which arm of government? The reality is that sustainable development really is supposed to be private sector driven. Government is essentially intended to create that environment for the private sector to drive development. And I'm coming from the angle of a recent figure that was put out by the African Development Bank, that to develop 18 agricultural value chains in Africa to drive economic transformation, we need $400 billion between now and the next 10 years. And if we are talking about $400 billion to transform 18 segments, 18 agricultural value chains, only, not talking about health, not talking about other issues that are pulling at the resources of government. So you could see that we should look to government to create the ambience, but the private sector should drive it. And that is why the agency called NISA was created by the Central Bank of Nigeria, so as to ensure that the private sector is brought into play, so as to actually bring about development in the agricultural space. And that agency is intended to create a structure around private sector participation in agriculture as a sector that can actually lead development and transformation in agriculture in Africa, in the African continent. And doing so requires organizing the operators in the agricultural value chain in such a way that the private sector has the confidence to interact with them and bring in the necessary resources that is intended to grow agriculture and make it contribute to the development of the African continent and the various African countries. That's my initial response, sir.
Thank you, Ernest. Now, to Your Excellency, sir. You're an economist. Outside the government, I'm sure by your training, it's the private sector that should drive sustainable growth. But the situation is different in Kebbi. I got this from your website, that Kebbi has a low level of soil fertility. And yet, despite that, you have made tremendous progress in that state, and a lot of things are happening there. Will you, my question, will you say that sustainable development is in the hands of government, and it's only government that can drive sustainable development in this country?
Thank you. Let me also join Greg in thanking the organizers for inviting me and congratulating all of you, particularly the President. And if one of the debate for being here is where to situate the local chapter, I wish at the end I would be given 3 minutes to make an advocacy for Kebbi State. But be that as it may, and before I comment on the question, if I can take 2 minutes to also contribute to Greg's initial take on the question that was posed about sustainable development in Africa and the responses. What, in your opinion? I think, in my opinion, the question has been asked wrongly, and it will lead to wrong answer. Africa is a collection of 55 different countries, 55 different political systems, economic systems, growing at different rates. And certainly, if the rates of growth is different, that means some are doing something right, whereas others not so right. So when someone is posed to answer the question in an aggregation, he might miss a very, very fundamental situation. We are not like China, where you have over 1.3 billion people organized under one political system, one currency, and one economic system. So secondly, I think in the choices that have been given of answers, one of the most important things for me as a practitioner of development, if I can be, on humility use that word, is missing, because African countries in general are overburdened by a distortionary trade and capital market system that is limiting our growth. We are not facing competition fairly. So the potential of my rice farmer in Kebbi, the potential of the cashew seller in Imo State is limited by an unfair trade practice, whereby countries that are industrialized, countries that are stronger in the world, have set up barriers to trade by distortionary practices that are limiting the ability of African entrepreneurs, African producers to sell to those markets. And that option has not been given for people to vote. So that's my contribution as far as that question is.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Maybe
then,
okay, you now want to go to my question. All
and
right.
then I can go to my question, whether as between government and private sector. I think there is no debate about the role of both. Countries that have achieved economic development have, at the point of economic takeoff, have been fairly reliant on government. And then after economic development has set in, the support begin to give impetus for the private sector to take over. We still have very, very good examples of statism, whereby by which government agencies are actively promoting economic growth and development. When people talk about Brazil, United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, we have seen a significant contribution of both governmental policy and governmental investment in order to provide the necessary takeoff which supports private sector activity. As a state governor, some of you might be accustomed to the numbers. They can even be depressing. And for example, in 2014, which is the last full year before I become governor, the total revenue of Kebbi State is less than $600 million. And about $400 million of it is personnel cost, meaning the amount of money available to the government to support developmental initiative, which will provide the impetus for the private sector to come. It's just with the fall, compare that to 2016, which is the first full year after I became governor, the revenue fell to about $130 million. Understandably, many of you will have known. Personnel cost remains the same. So money to invest, to build more classrooms, to repair roads, to support private sector, even to market the state has dropped significantly. So, but the key role for the government then becomes, as always, to draw attention to the potentials of the state, to participate, and that's where maybe the Chartered Institute will come in more, to participate in providing comfort and a system of dispute resolution that will encourage and make it easy for private sector to do what they know how to do best. And by private sector, I don't mean large companies. I mean the individual, hardworking women, men, boys, girls, entrepreneurs who are looking for a space to express their talent, to expand their capacity so that they can contribute. I mean those hardworking groundnut producers, those hardworking milk producers who are otherwise victims of a trade arrangement where, because of distortion elsewhere, products come in of doubtful quality that compete and limit their ability to sell both in the domestic market and even to sell elsewhere. So, thank you. That's one of the key roles for government. And I must thank both President Muhammadu Buhari and Vice President Yomi Osibajo, because part of the success story in rice is because the federal government appreciated that Nigeria can feed itself. Nigeria is competitive in rice. We should be the ones selling rice to Thailand rather than the other way around. So the presidential, I'm sure Dr. Jumoke will talk about the presidential initiative. So it is this appreciation, consistency that is providing the platform and the synergy between both federal government, state government, and domestic response to the policy support that is providing impetus for us to do it. Just today I was at Lagos and I made the remark that without Lagos State there wouldn't have been Kebbi rice, because the Lagosians, being the most sophisticated market, the most critical market, will tease out a product, will not buy it for any sentiment except if it works. So for Lagos to accept that Nigerian rice is better, whether it is Abakaliki rice or Anambra rice or Mitros rice from Ogun or from Katsina, that is better than the imported brand, shows how much we can achieve in a very limited time if we appreciate our potentials and compensate, very, very important, and compensate for the distortions that are coming and visited upon from us by unfair trading practices, which even the World Trade Organization have not been able to help us with.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Let me go to Dr. Duwole and Mr. Noyemi now. Now the question is, Nigeria jumped 24 places in the latest doing business report. I'm sure you want to comment on that, Dr. Duwole first, and then we'll go to Mr. Noyemi.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. I wouldn't want to dwell on 24 places movement. That is just a number, it's a ranking. The Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council was established in 2016 really to make Nigeria a progressively easier place in which to do business. So that means looking at the business climate in its entirety, particularly for SMEs, as His Excellency has noted. They are the engine of the economy. About 90% of businesses in Nigeria are MSMEs. They employ about 80% of labor and contribute just under 50% to the GDP. So the initiative looks at removing bottlenecks in terms of making sure there's transparency, which addresses the corruption concern, because when things are demystified, when there's transparency, then people know their rights and they're not able to be extorted. Also making sure that the ease and the speed of doing business, the cost and the time involved is reduced. So that's basically in a nutshell what the PEBEC is about. We take things systemically. We go through national action plans, usually in 60-day tranches. Right now, we're working on legislative interventions. We collaborate very well with the National Assembly and with the legal community. The Nigerian Bar Association section of business law is a strong partner of ours, and we were able to jointly push forward 2 legislations last year, which were signed by the president, then acting president. And this year we've been working on, you saw the Senate has passed the CAM bill, and we're waiting for the House of Representatives. We also have an omnibus bill, which the legal community and the private sector contributed robustly to, that we're hoping to get through before May of next year. So there's quite a bit going on, regulatory reforms as well, and then we work across all the states at a subnational level. So when you look at rankings, what to really focus on is, are things actually being felt? Are they trickling down? Are private sector validating the reforms? Are they aware of the reforms, and are they using the reforms? We get a lot of interface. We engage a lot with key stakeholders, organized private sector in particular, and then we have focused group sessions with leading contributors also. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint, so we continue to take feedback and to work on it. And I can give you a lot more details on the work that we've been doing, but I think I'll rest on that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nehemi, you are Chief Negotiator. Now, can you tell us, do you want to say something about that, Mr. Aditola Nehemi?
Thank you very much. I'm an head of trade remedies and assistant chief negotiator at the Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiations. So there are a number of things to talk about, and I'll probably just start on trade remedies because I probably think it applies a lot more to the agribusiness community. So trade remedies basically is something that should go live very shortly. All the work that needs to go into designing a framework for it is being finalized. What basically means is a threefold system against anti-dumping, subsidies, and safeguards. Basically, the idea is that as a country, as you start opening up yourself to trade, what happens automatically is that you're going to have to compete in a global market with every other business. But the first market you want to ensure that you have some balance is your domestic market. So for instance, I'll use a dumping example. Let's say, for instance, like the governor of Kebbi has been speaking for quite a while about rice from Kebbi. Let's assume that, say, a country like, say, Thailand or Malaysia sells rice at a way lower price in the Nigerian market than it sells at its own market. That is very dangerous for the Nigerian farmer who, as I said, is already playing against competition. So one of the things that dumping allows you to do is allows you to investigate that entire procedure and then levy an extra duty to countervail that effect. And there's also that kind of system for subsidies, which is even a more popular system for farming, like the US Farm Bill, which is a very strong subsidization for agriculture. So that's a big part of what the trade remedies mechanism looks like. Basically, it's a system to ensure that you can protect the domestic industry from unfair and injurious practices from foreign companies and from foreign countries. But the second part, which is the more dominant part you know all about, is the trade negotiation part, which is what bettered the CFTA agreement, where Nigeria chaired at both the ministerial level and the negotiating forum. And so a good part of that is ensuring that Nigeria's interest, and Nigeria takes leadership within the African space and also even globally, and that our interactions with other states parties is intentional and is well planned. So for instance, one of the big things we've been working on for the last few months, which has been validated, is a schedule on goods for Nigeria and a schedule on services. Basically, what happened before now is a lot of times we get into negotiations or get into the detailing of our tariff system, which isn't clear about whose interest it actually favors. But one thing we've done is there's been a lot of stakeholder engagements around the country, getting inputs from Manufacturers Association of Nigeria and different key stakeholders, NASIMA, NASME, and even farmers, and getting the things they care the most about and ensuring that in negotiating tariff preferences, that there is a preference and there is a leaning over to ensure that sustainably the economies of Nigeria and the businesses that are in the country can take off and can start to grow gradually. So basically it takes into place the interests of the common market while ensuring that, of course, the consumer's interest is also protected, but that there's a minimum tariff line and minimum expectations of preferences that is maintained. And so that's basically a good part of the work that the trade office has been doing, and that's a good part of what I've been doing.
Thank you very much. Now we go on to the second poll. We can now have the second poll. What, in your opinion, will be the biggest driver of Africa's sustainable growth? I expect your feedback. What, in your opinion, will be the biggest driver of Africa's sustainable growth? We have agriculture, manufacturing, inter-Africa trade, effective dispute resolution, a combination of the above. Well, while we are doing that, let me go to Greg. Greg, before we can have an enabling environment for sustainable development, the legal system must be properly, okay. You practice elsewhere, and you are seeing Nigerian legal system. I've studied them, and you also know what we are here in Nigeria. What is your assessment of the legal system in Nigeria and the legal practitioners?
I think that's a trick question, given I'm speaking to a Nigerian legal audience. But my assessment of the Nigerian legal markets and the Nigerian legal practitioners is phenomenally positive. And I've passed on my assessment to all my colleagues in my company and generally outside. And I think the quality of legal schools in Nigeria seems to be extremely good. But even more than that, the quality and the standards of the profession in Nigeria is phenomenally impressive. The only other country that I can compare that with, in my experience, is India, which has a similar, very, very high level of extremely educated lawyers. Whether or not the parallels are the same, whether or not that's because the profession is slightly constrained, I don't know, and I leave it to others in the audience to judge. But my view is that the Nigerian legal market and the Nigerian legal experience will in future become a prime driver for the changes that will ultimately need to happen in Nigeria, because it's about the rule of law. Without the rule of law, no country can advance to the level that everyone in Nigeria wants it to. And I think the Nigerian legal profession is prime place to make that happen.
Thank you very much. Now, let me move back to the representative of the MD of NISA. How do you support small-scale agri farmers or businessmen, especially when it comes to dispute resolution?
The smallholder farmers require access to inputs so as to be able to produce competitively, and they also require access to markets so as to get reasonable return for their efforts. And within this context, you find issues of conflicts in terms of negotiating price and quality and timeliness of delivery and rates that are competitive. So on the side of input supplies and aggregating the farmers so as to have access to inputs, this presents issues around disputes. And on the market side, when they when they harvest their crops, they have to supply to the off-takers who require certain quality standards and specifications, and who may have locked in an agreement at the beginning of the production cycle. And so some conflicts arise at that end. Particularly, we have a challenge in the area of side selling, where you find smallholder farmers who, because of the unstructured market, commodity market in the country, are inclined to sell their produce to whoever comes when they are pressed. without respecting covenants and agreements that are entered at the beginning of the production cycle. So this side selling thing is a major challenge. And so NISAL, the Nigerian Incentive-Based Risk Sharing System for Agricultural Lending, in its value chain fixing effort, works with covenants, agreements, and memorandums of understanding. And we build in the alternative dispute resolution clause as a substantial element in these contracts that we structure between primary producers and their off-takers. And so this is an area where NISAL is helping to manage the relationship between the production and the production of agricultural produce and the off-take. And that way we help to stabilize the relationship between those parties. And in the process, we build confidence which is necessary to attract continued flow of financing, which ultimately will lift the farmers out of poverty.
Thank you.
So in structuring our contracts and recognizing the alternative dispute resolution strategy, we are helping to stabilize that relationship.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, sir, you mentioned in your earlier statement that you support the farmers in dispute resolution. In fact, you did mention that you wish that the institute is also established in Kebbi. Now, how do you build in the issue of dispute resolution in Kebbi State, especially among the micro and small scale farmers?
Thank you. I think a starting point is the appreciation that agriculture, particularly in Nigeria,